Mr. Ferguson, thanks for taking some time to join us.
Thank you.
Let's start with the socioeconomic gaps on First Nations, and what did the audit find in that area?
So what we looked at there was, how the government measures the socioeconomic gap between First Nations people living on reserve and other people living in Canada. So trying to understand, how do you look at that socioeconomic gap? How do you measure it? How do you know how big it is? And then how do you reduce it? What we found was really the government does not have a good way of measuring the socioeconomic gap to understand exactly whether the condition of people living on reserve is improving compared to the conditions of other people in the country. What we looked at specifically was education results, for example, and we found significant differences in education results. The Department of Indigenous Services identifies that 49% of on-reserve First Nations high school students who start grade 12, only 49% of them actually complete grade 12 within that year. We went back and looked at First Nations on-reserve students who started grade 9 and found that only 25% of them complete grade 12 4 years later on. So those are results that are much worse than for other populations in Canada. And when only 25% of students that start grade 9 can complete grade 12 within that 4-year time period. So we identified a number of different issues there that indicate that the socioeconomic gap is not only not understood, there doesn't seem to be indications that the socioeconomic gap is reducing.
What would be your recommendations to, get some better data on that?
Well, I think the first thing, again, and all of this needs to be done working with First Nations groups, First Nations organizations, is to understand what is the objective, what are the important components of the socioeconomic gaps. And First Nations people told us that that needs to include things like culture and language as well. To understand what the condition is of people on First Nations. The Department of Indigenous Services does have what they call a community well-being index, which does look at some aspects of conditions on First Nations reserves. And in that community well-being index, they have identified that out of the 100 worst off communities in Canada, 98 of them are First Nations communities. Wow. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Not a surprise there, I guess. Let's move to employment training, something we hear a lot about. What are some of the highlights in this report?
Well, so we looked at a couple of programs that the Department of Employment Services does, particularly aimed at Indigenous people. They spend over $350 million a year, or about $350 million a year, trying to help Indigenous people find meaningful and sustainable employment. But again, there's no definition of what sustainable employment means. So what they know is, well, first of all, they don't have any information, again, on 22% of the Indigenous people that get services under these programs, services that are supposed to help them be able to find that meaningful, sustainable employment. Of the rest of them, they do know that a number of people, Indigenous people, do eventually find employment after receiving these services that the department pays for, but they don't know whether it is long-term, sustainable, meaningful employment, or whether it's just very short-term, working a few days on a project. So the department really needs to understand what the outcomes are. We went through and analyzed their data, and we identified things like apprenticeship programs seem to be a good way of helping Indigenous people find employment. We also found, though, that about 16% of the Indigenous people who get services under these programs actually receive 5 or more services. So are all of those services actually leading to sustainable employment is what the department needs to figure out.
Mr. Ferguson, always interesting reports. Appreciate you taking some time for us here today.
Thank you. Appreciate your interest.